Chapter 1. The Three Voices in the Silence. That morning, the rain fell with the force of a secret being revealed to the heavens. Inside a hospital in Galway, three cries echoed at the same time, but no one answered them. Only the sound of trolley wheels being pushed and a door closing sealed the fate of 3 lives. 18 years later, all of Ireland would hear those voices again, and nothing would ever be the same. Among respected faces and buried lies, the truth would begin to emerge from where it was least expected, from the hands of those who had kept silent for nearly 2 decades. And when that secret came to light, the entire country would discover that there are sins that neither time nor reputation can hide. The smell of antiseptic and rain mingled in the corridor of University Hospital Galway that November dawn in 2007. The lights flickered in bluish tones over the pale woman on the trolley. Moira Walsh, 28 years old, her fingers buried in the sheet. In the corner, her husband, Declan Walsh, kept his gaze fixed on the window, where his own reflection seemed to stare back at him. 3 cries echoed almost simultaneously, 3 newborns wrapped in blankets. For an instant, time seemed to stop, but Declan didn't move. He simply said in a low voice, "No one needs to know." Nurse Grace Adeyemi, newly arrived from Nigeria, froze. The babies were black. The husband turned his face away, and Moira's expression crumbled into contained tears. Between guilt and panic, the doctor tried to break the silence. "Would you like to hold them?" But Declan responded with a coldness that cut through the air like a blade. "Leave them. They've been a mistake from the start." The nurse stepped back with watery eyes, watching as that woman stretched out her arms by instinct, and then gave up. Hours later, when Grace returned to clean the room, she found a small envelope with the blue ribbon attached. Inside were 3 identification bracelets and a sentence written in Moira's trembling handwriting. "If anyone finds this, tell them I sang for them." The nurse tucked the envelope into her pocket, vowing never to forget. The distant sound of a car leaving the hospital echoed in the early morning, and Grace knew, somehow, that triple cry would return to haunt Galway. In the corridor, a security guard commented in whispers, "Mr. Walsh is the new state prosecutor. No one's going to talk about this." The imaginary camera pulled away from the hospital, and the sound of the 3 cries merged with the rain falling on the roof. Outside, the Atlantic wind howled against the windows, carrying with it the weight of a secret that would take 18 years to resurface. Grace stood by the window, watching the car's red tail lights disappear into the mist, clutching the envelope against her chest as though it were a sacred relic. She didn't know then that she was holding the first piece of a puzzle that would shatter lives, reputations, and the very foundation of what Galway believed about justice and mercy. In her hand, 3 small bracelets bore names that would never be spoken in that hospital again. Baby boy A, baby boy B, baby girl C. 3 souls reduced to letters. 3 voices silenced before they could even speak. Moira lay motionless on the bed, her face turned towards the wall, her breath shallow and ragged. She had sung to them, softly, desperately, whilst the midwife cleaned them, whilst Declan made phone calls in the corridor, whilst the world kept turning as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She had sung an old lullaby her own mother had taught her, the words in Irish slipping from her lips like prayers. Swan tre num blianta, the lullaby of the years. But when the door closed and the sound of tiny cries faded down the hallway, Moira pressed her face into the pillow and wept silently. She wept for the children she would never know. She wept for the marriage that had just died in that room. And she wept for herself, for the woman she had been just hours before, and the ghost she had become. Grace stood in the corridor long after her shift had ended, the envelope burning in her pocket like a live coal. She thought about her own journey to Ireland, about the promises of a better life, about the oath she had taken to protect and care for all who needed her. And now she carried a secret that could destroy a man's career, a woman's sanity, and 3 children's futures. As dawn broke over Galway Bay, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink, Grace made a decision. She would keep the envelope. She would remember those 3 voices. And someday, when the time was right, she would make sure the truth found its way home. In the car park below, Declan Walsh sat behind the wheel of his Mercedes, gripping it so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He hadn't started the engine yet. He was staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror, searching for something, perhaps remorse, perhaps justification, perhaps just the courage to drive away and never look back. He found none of those things, only the face of a man who had just made a choice that would define the rest of his life. Chapter 2. The Children of the Sea. 18 years later, the Atlantic wind battered against the cliffs of Salt Hill when Sean Ni Dubain, law student, adjusted his scarf before entering the university. He had grown up in temporary homes, amongst families who called him a divine gift and others who saw him as a burden. On the radio, a news report about a charity event in Dublin announced the presence of Judge Declan Walsh, the same name he saw every day engraved on the faculty wall. He didn't know why, but that coincidence chilled his chest. That same afternoon, Aidan Fiacre, his biological brother, unknowingly, unloaded cement at a construction site in the same city. The foreman, laughing, commented, "You've got the look of the Walshes, lad, you talk like them." Aidan only laughed, ignoring the strange sensation that phrase was hiding something. In another corner of Ireland, Niamh Adeyemi, junior reporter for the Connaught Tribune, was reviewing a story about poorly documented adoption scandals. Her adoptive mother, the nurse Grace, avoided talking about 2007, but when Niamh found an old envelope with a blue ribbon in a box, the past began to breathe again. She held the 3 bracelets and, with her heart racing, whispered, "Why did you keep this, ma'am?" Grace went pale, trying to take the envelope back, but the young woman stepped away, sensing something terribly wrong. "Don't touch that, Niamh. There are things that time buries for a reason," the girl responded firmly, "and there are truths that time never erases." Sean had always felt like a visitor in his own life. 20 families in 18 years. Some kind, most indifferent, a few cruel. He remembered Mrs. O'Sullivan in Clifton, who used to make him sleep in the conservatory because the color might rub off on the good furniture. He remembered Mr. Brennan in Tuam, who called him the charity case in front of his own children. And he remembered the social worker, a tired woman named Fiona, who once told him, "You're lucky, Sean. Some children never get chosen at all." But he never felt lucky. He felt like a puzzle piece that didn't fit anywhere. A question without an answer, a name without a story. When he got into university to study law, he told himself it was because he wanted to help people like him. The forgotten ones. The ones whose files were too complicated, whose pasts were too messy to unravel. But deep down, he knew he was searching for something else. He was searching for himself. Niamh had grown up differently. Grace Adeyemi had raised her with fierce love, the kind that came from knowing what it meant to save a life. Grace never spoke about her early years in Ireland, about the lonely nights in the hospital, about the patients she couldn't help, and the secrets she couldn't share. But she poured everything she had into Niamh. Education, opportunity, unconditional support. "You're going to change this country," Grace would say, her Nigerian accent still strong after 2 decades. "You're going to tell the stories no one else will." And Niamh believed her. She had become a journalist not for the fame or the bylines, but because she had inherited her mother's sense of justice. She covered local council meetings, planning disputes, school funding cuts, the unglamorous stories that actually mattered to ordinary people. But lately something had been pulling her towards a different kind of story. The kind with secrets buried in hospital records and lies hidden in official documents. The envelope had fallen from a box of old photographs whilst Niamh was helping her mother clear out the attic. At first she thought it was just medical waste, something Grace had accidentally brought home years ago. But when she opened it and saw the 3 bracelets, baby boy A, baby boy B, baby girl C, and the note in that desperate handwriting, her journalist's instinct kicked in. Grace had tried to snatch it away, her hands trembling, her eyes wild with something Niamh had never seen before. Fear. "Please, love. Please don't." But Niamh was already reading the words, already imagining the story, already feeling the weight of 18 years of silence pressing down on her mother's shoulders. "Who are they?" Niamh asked, her voice barely a whisper. Grace closed the door and leaned her forehead against the wood. Outside, the rain began again, and she whispered to herself, "They're going to find each other, whether I want them to or not." Aidan Fiacre didn't think much about his origins. He was too busy surviving. The building sites of Dublin paid well enough if you worked hard and kept your head down, and Aidan had learned to do both. His foster parents, the Fiatres, had been decent people, farmers in County Clare who needed an extra pair of hands and didn't mind that those hands were a different color than theirs. They had given him their name, a roof, and 3 meals a day. They hadn't given him warmth, but Aiden had learned not to expect it. What bothered him wasn't the cold treatment or the suspicious looks from neighbors. It was the sense that he was living someone else's life, wearing someone else's skin. Sometimes late at night in his rented room in Phibbsboro, he would stare at his reflection and wonder who he was supposed to be. The face staring back was handsome enough, strong jaw, clear eyes, the build of someone used to physical labor, but it felt like a mask hiding something essential. When the foreman made that comment about him looking like the Walshes, Aiden had laughed it off. But later, carrying planks up the scaffolding, he found himself thinking about it. The Walshes. He knew the name from the papers. Judge Declan Walsh, the man who never smiled in photographs. The prosecutor-turned-judge who had built his career on being tougher than anyone else on crime. What would someone like that have to do with someone like him? Grace stood at her kitchen window that evening, watching the lights of Galway flicker on one by one. She had kept the secret for 18 years, had told herself it was for the best, that some truths were too dangerous to speak. But now, holding Neve's questions in her mind like stones, she wondered if silence had ever really protected anyone. She thought about that November night in 2007, about Moira's broken whispers and Declan's cold dismissal, about 3 tiny faces she had memorized before they were taken away. She had sung to them too, while she cleaned them and weighed them, and filled out the forms that would send them to different corners of Ireland. She had sung the same lullaby Moira had sung, her voice cracking on the Irish words she barely knew. And now, somehow, impossibly, they were coming back. She could feel it in her bones, in the way Neve's eyes had burned with determination, in the way the envelope had seemed to pulse with life after years of dormancy. The children of the sea were returning to shore, and Grace knew that when they did, the waves would carry more than just truth. They would carry reckoning. Chapter 3. Echoes in Dublin. The hall of Dublin Castle was illuminated by golden chandeliers when Declan Walsh stepped onto the stage. Cameras captured every gesture of the man who, for years, had been a symbol of integrity. Amongst the guests, Sean, present by chance as a student chosen to represent his class, watched the judge with fascination and discomfort. Something about that face bothered him. The same jawline, the same almost invisible scar. When the judge raised his glass and thanked his wife for 18 years of silence and loyalty, Sean swallowed hard. In the corner of the hall, Neve was covering the event for the newspaper. When she heard that speech, something in her body reacted. She opened the envelope and looked at the bracelets. The hospital name, the same month, the same day, the same surname. A wave of vertigo took hold of her. She looked at the stage, and had the certainty that the man before her was hiding the past. Meanwhile, at that very moment, Aiden was delivering materials to the venue and saw the judge on a television screen. The sound of glasses clinking, the laughter of the elite, and a face that seemed familiar to him. He looked at his hands, the same skin tone, the same fold under the eyes. In the reflection of the shop window, he saw his own face split with the judge's, and the world seemed to collapse in silence. The Dublin Castle event was meant to celebrate 20 years of judicial reform in Ireland. Declan Walsh stood at the podium, his silver hair perfectly combed, his navy suit immaculate, his voice steady and authoritative. He spoke about justice, about accountability, about the sacred duty of the law to protect the vulnerable. The audience applauded at all the right moments. Journalists scribbled notes. Photographers captured the perfect angle of a man who had never put a foot wrong in his entire career. But Sean couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at a ghost, or perhaps a mirror. He had been chosen to attend because of his essay on restorative justice, a passionate argument about giving second chances to those the system had failed. His professor had called it brilliant and deeply personal. Sean hadn't told her it was personal because he was writing about himself, about the boy who had been failed by every system meant to protect him. Now, sitting in this gilded hall amongst Dublin's legal elite, wearing a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit, Sean felt the familiar sensation of not belonging. But this time, it was different. This time, he felt like he was supposed to be here, like some invisible thread had pulled him to this exact moment. When Declan Walsh mentioned 18 years, Sean's hands began to tremble. Neve had positioned herself strategically near the stage, her press badge giving her access other reporters didn't have. The Connaught Tribune wasn't important enough to get prime placement, but Neve had learned to use her relative anonymity to her advantage. People talked more freely around journalists they didn't recognize. She had her phone recording in her pocket, her notepad ready, and the envelope, that damned envelope, burning in her bag like radioactive material. She had spent the previous 3 days trying to verify what she suspected. Birth records from University Hospital Galway in November 2007. Adoption files that had been sealed. Dead ends and bureaucratic walls at every turn. But she had found one piece of confirmation. Judge Declan Walsh had been a prosecutor in Galway in 2007. His wife, Moira Walsh, had been admitted to University Hospital Galway on November 12, 2007. And 3 babies, triplets, had been born that night and immediately placed into emergency foster care. The official record said the mother had been unable to care for them due to medical and psychological complications. The father's name was redacted. But Niamh knew how to read between the lines of official documents. She knew what redacted meant when it came to powerful men. She knew what complications meant when it came to women who had no choice. Aidan had been hired to deliver sound equipment to Dublin Castle for the event. It was good money for an afternoon's work, and he had taken it without asking questions. He was setting up speakers in the back hall when he heard the speech beginning, when he saw the face on the television monitor, when something inside him cracked open like an egg. He had never known his biological parents. The fiacres had told him his mother had been troubled and his father unknown. He had accepted this the way children accept rain or hunger, as an unchangeable fact of existence. But standing there, watching Declan Walsh speak about integrity and duty, Aidan felt a recognition so profound it was almost physical. He knew that face, not from memory, but from something deeper, from blood. He stepped closer to the monitor, ignoring his supervisor's irritated shout. The judge was saying something about family, about sacrifice, about the difficult choices men in positions of power must make. And then his wife stood up, a pale, elegant woman in a gray dress, and the judge smiled at her with such calculated tenderness that Aidan felt nauseous. In the shop window's reflection, Aidan saw himself, 25 years old, strong from manual labor, with features that didn't quite match either of his foster parents. And beside his reflection on the television screen was Declan Walsh, 50 years old, powerful, respected, with a jawline that could have been carved from the same mold. Niamh made her decision in an instant. She pushed through the crowd of journalists, her press badge held high, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached the stage stairs just as Declan Walsh was finishing his speech. The security guard moved to stop her, but she was already climbing, already extending her microphone, already asking the question that would change everything. Mr. Walsh, her voice cut through the applause like a knife. Were you ever at Galway Hospital in November 2007? The hall froze. Every camera swiveled towards her. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. And Declan Walsh, for just a fraction of a second, looked like a man who had been shot. Then the mask slipped back into place. He smiled, a smile trained over decades of courtroom battles and political negotiations. I don't recall, miss. Many years, many cases. But sweat had begun to trickle down his temple. Moira, seated in the front row, lowered her gaze and clutched the crucifix she wore around her neck. Grace, watching on television from her flat in Galway, brought her hands to her mouth. She's found out, she whispered. Niamh, not lowering the microphone, pressed on. Because I found this. And she raised the 3 bracelets with the hospital logo. The audience murmured. Declan tried to maintain control, but the cameras caught the tremor in his voice. I don't know what you're talking about. But Moira rose slowly, and for the first time in 18 years faced her husband. You do, Declan. You do. The security guards approached and the presenter tried to end the event. But chaos had already been unleashed. As camera flashes fired, Niamh felt a hand touch her shoulder. It was Sean, pale, confused. Why do you have those bracelets? I was born in Galway, November 2007. Their eyes met. Aidan, from outside, was watching through the window, and in the reflection of the glass, 3 identical faces stared at each other for the first time. Moira collapsed, and as she fell, a small blue ribbon escaped from her handbag and landed at Declan's feet. He recognized it immediately. The ribbon from the letter that was never delivered. Chapter 4. The name that cannot be spoken. The question echoed like a gunshot. The judge smiled, a trained smile from someone who had learned to lie. I don't recall, miss. Many years, many cases. but sweat began to trickle down his temple. Moira, seated in the front row, lowered her gaze and clutched the crucifix she wore around her neck. Grace, watching on television in Galway, brought her hands to her mouth. "She's found out," she whispered. Niamh, without lowering the microphone, retorted, "Because I found this." And she raised the 3 bracelets with the hospital logo. The audience murmured. Declan tried to maintain control, but the cameras caught the tremor in his voice. "I don't know what you're talking about." But Moira rose slowly and for the first time in 18 years, faced her husband. "You do, Declan. You do." The security guards approached and the presenter tried to end the event, but chaos had already been unleashed. As flashes fired, Niamh felt a hand touch her shoulder. It was Sean, pale, confused. "Why do you have those bracelets?" I was born in Galway, November 2007. Their eyes met. Aidan, from outside, was watching through the window, and in the reflection of the glass, 3 identical faces stared at each other for the first time. The moment Moira spoke those 4 words, "You do, Declan. You do." 18 years of carefully constructed lies began to crumble like a building condemned from within. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. In the sudden, absolute silence of Dublin Castle's Grand Hall, every syllable carried the weight of nearly 2 decades of suppressed truth. Declan's face underwent a transformation that the cameras captured in excruciating detail. The mask of judicial composure slipped, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His hand reached instinctively for the podium to steady himself, and for a moment, he looked exactly like what he was, a frightened man whose past had finally caught up with him. The security guards were advancing now, unsure whether to escort Niamh off the stage or to protect the judge from whatever was unfolding. But Moira stopped them with a single gesture, her hand raised, palm out, with an authority born not from power but from suffering. "Let her speak," Moira said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "God knows I should have spoken years ago." Niamh stood frozen, the 3 bracelets dangling from her fingers like pieces of evidence at a trial. She had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed what she would say, but nothing had prepared her for the raw emotion now flooding the room. She looked at the bracelets, then at Declan, then at Moira, and finally at the young man who had touched her shoulder, Sean, whose dark eyes held a mixture of confusion and dawning recognition. "I was adopted," Sean said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow audible in the hushed hall. 18 years ago, from Galway. They told me my mother was unable to care for me. They never told me why." He looked at Declan, then at Moira, and something in his face shifted. "They never told me I had siblings." Outside the window, Aidan had pressed his face against the glass, his breath fogging the pain. He could see 3 faces on the television monitor inside. The judge, pale and shaking, a young woman holding something in her hands, and a young man who could have been his reflection. His phone was in his pocket, but he couldn't move to reach it. He was paralyzed by the certainty that his entire life had been a lie, and the truth was unfolding just meters away from him, separated only by glass and 18 years of silence. Grace, in her Galway flat, had stood up from her chair, the remote control falling from her hands onto the carpet. She could see it all happening on the screen, could see the moment she had dreaded and perhaps secretly hoped for since that November night in 2007. She had kept the envelope because she couldn't bear to destroy it. She had kept the recording because she believed, somewhere deep in her soul, that the truth had a way of demanding to be heard. "There were 3, Grace whispered to her empty sitting room, tears streaming down her face. 3 babies, 3 voices crying out in that corridor, and I heard every one of them." Back in Dublin Castle, Moira had begun to walk towards the stage. Her legs were unsteady, her face the color of paper, but she moved with the determination of someone who had been carrying a burden for too long and could finally set it down. The crowd parted for her, journalists and dignitaries alike stepping back as if making way for something sacred and terrible. "Moira, don't," Declan's voice cracked, all pretense of composure abandoned. "Please, think about what you're doing." "I've done nothing but think for 18 years, Moira replied. She reached the stage and looked directly at Sean. Up close, she could see what everyone else in the room was beginning to see. The shape of his face was her face. The set of his jaw was Declan's jaw. The color of his skin was the truth they had tried to bury. "I'm so sorry," she said, and those 3 words contained every moment of regret, every night of broken sleep, Every time she had passed a young man on the street and wondered if he could be her son. Sean took a step back, his mind reeling. Are you saying you're my mother? Niev, finding her voice again, spoke with the clarity of a journalist who had finally found the story of a lifetime. Not just yours. There were 3. Triplets. Born on November 12, 2007 at University Hospital, Galway. All placed immediately into foster care. All separated. She held up the bracelets again. These are their identification tags. Baby boy A, baby boy B, baby girl C. The room erupted. Questions flew from every direction. Cameras flashed like lightning. The presenter was shouting for order, but no one was listening. And through it all, Declan Walsh stood at the podium, watching his carefully constructed life disintegrate in real time. It was Aidan who broke the paralysis outside. He pushed through the delivery entrance, past the staff who tried to stop him, through corridors he had navigated earlier whilst delivering equipment. He could hear the commotion from the main hall, could follow the sound of raised voices and camera shutters clicking. And then he was there, standing at the back of the hall, staring at the stage where his entire world was being rewritten. Sean saw him first, turned, as if sensing a presence, and found himself looking at a face so similar to his own it was like seeing a photograph come to life. They stared at each other across the crowded room, 2 young men who had lived parallel lives without knowing the other existed. Then Aidan saw Niamh, and she saw him, and the 3 of them stood frozen in a triangle of recognition. Same eyes, same build, same small scar on the left eyebrow that none of them remembered getting, but all of them had. Moira collapsed. Not dramatically, not with a cry, but simply as if the strings holding her up had been cut. She fell to her knees on the stage, and as she did, her handbag tipped over, spilling its contents across the polished wood. Lipstick, keys, a worn prayer book, and a small blue ribbon, faded from 18 years but still intact, still tied in the same careful bow it had been tied in when she had written that note in a hospital room whilst her babies cried in another corridor. The ribbon rolled across the stage and came to rest at Declan's feet. He stared at it as if it were a living thing, as if it could speak and condemn him more thoroughly than any witness ever could. Then he bent down, picked it up with shaking fingers, and held it up to the light. "This is the ribbon," he said, his voice hollow, "from the letter that was never delivered." Chapter 5. The voice that stayed trapped. The sound of sirens cut through the air around Dublin Castle. Moira Walsh was carried away unconscious to the hospital, and Declan tried to follow her, but a crowd of reporters surrounded him. The questions were like blades. Who are these children? Did you abandon triplets in 2007? Is it true that one of them is your law student? Declan kept his face upright, but his eyes trembled. Deep down he knew. The truth had returned to collect its debt. Meanwhile, Niamh and Sean waited in reception, not knowing what to say. The tension was thick, almost physical. "We have the same date of birth, the same hospital, and the same color eyes," Sean murmured, trying to laugh without success. Niamh clutched the envelope tightly. "There's someone else who knows everything," she said. "The woman who kept this all these years." The imaginary camera focused on the window, where Grace Adeyemi appeared with an umbrella, watching from a distance, with an indecipherable expression. When she entered the hospital, silence took over the foyer. Declan recognized her instantly. "You," he whispered, breathless. "I should have sent you away when I had the chance." Grace took a deep breath, removed an old tape recording from her pocket. "You did send me away, yes, but I took with me the sound you tried to erase." She handed the small recorder to Sean and Niamh. "Listen to this, and then tell me if you can hate her." The hospital corridor smelled of disinfectant and fear. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made everyone look like ghosts. Sean and Niamh sat on plastic chairs that had been designed for maximum discomfort, as if the hospital wanted to remind visitors that suffering was the natural state of being within these walls. Aidan arrived 20 minutes later, still wearing his work clothes, cement dust on his boots, confusion written across every line of his face. He had run most of the way from Dublin Castle, pushing through crowds of journalists and curious onlookers, following the ambulance with Moira Walsh inside. He didn't know why he was following. He just knew he had to. When he entered the waiting area and saw Sean and Niamh sitting there, something inside him settled. Not peace exactly, but recognition. The 3 of them looked at each other, really looked for the first time, and saw themselves reflected back in ways that had nothing to do with mirrors, and everything to do with blood. I'm Aiden, he said, his voice rough from running and emotion. I think I might be your brother. Neve stood up, the envelope still clutched in her hands. I'm Neve, and this is Sean, and we were all born on the same night in Galway, 18 years ago. She held out the bracelets. Baby boy A, baby boy B, baby girl C. Aiden stared at the tiny plastic bands, each one barely bigger than his thumb, each one marking a life that had been separated before it had even begun. Which one am I? He asked. I don't know, Neve admitted. The records don't say. They just say 3 babies were placed into emergency care. 3 files were opened. 3 children were sent to different corners of Ireland. She looked at Grace, who had been standing apart, watching them with an expression of such profound sorrow that it hurt to look at her. But she knows. She was there. Grace Adiemi had aged 20 years in the past hour. The weight of 18 years of silence was visible in every line of her face, every gray hair, every tremor in her hands. She had kept this secret to protect them, or so she had told herself. Now she wondered if silence had ever protected anyone, or if it had just allowed wounds to fester in the dark. I was the nurse on duty that night, Grace said, her Nigerian accent somehow more pronounced now, as if stress had stripped away the Irish inflection she had learned over 2 decades. I saw you born. I cleaned you. I weighed you. I sang to you when your mother... Her voice cracked. When your mother couldn't. Sean's hands were shaking. Why couldn't she? Grace looked at Declan, who had finally managed to push his way through the reporters and was now standing in the doorway, looking like a man on trial. Because he told her she couldn't. Because he said it would ruin everything. Because he made her believe that loving you would destroy her. That's not... Declan started, but his voice died. What could he say? What defense could possibly justify what he had done? Grace pulled out the tape recorder, a small, old-fashioned device that looked like it belonged in a museum. After you left the hospital, she said to Declan, after you took your wife home and pretended nothing had happened, I went back to the delivery room to clean up, and I found this. She held up a small tape cassette. Moira had recorded something. I think she meant to leave it for you, but you were already gone. She pressed play. At first, there was nothing but static and the distant sound of medical equipment beeping. Then, a voice, weak, broken, but unmistakably singing. A lullaby in Irish, the words ancient and beautiful, the melody carrying centuries of Irish sorrow and love. Suantrai Namblianta, a storm o' Croy, lullaby of the years, treasure of my heart. The voice continued, singing through tears, singing through exhaustion, singing because it was the only thing left to give. And then at the end, a whisper, forgive me. I loved you from the moment I felt you move inside me. But love isn't always enough to protect you. I hope wherever you are, you know that I sang for you, that I wanted you, that if I could have been braver. The recording ended with a sob, and then silence. The waiting room had gone absolutely still. Even the distant sound of hospital machinery seemed to have paused, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Sean had tears streaming down his face. Neve had her hand over her mouth. Aiden was staring at the tape recorder as if it contained answers to every question he had ever asked about himself. She tried to come back, Grace said quietly. 3 months later, I saw her in the car park just sitting there staring at the hospital entrance. She didn't come in. She sat there for 2 hours and then she drove away. I saw her do the same thing 6 months after that, and then a year later. And then she stopped coming. Declan had sunk into a chair, his face in his hands. I told her it was for the best, he said, his voice muffled. I told her we could start over, that no one needed to know, that we could have other children, the right kind of children, and everything would be fine. The right kind, Neve repeated, her voice sharp with anger. You mean white children? Declan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. Sean stood up, walked over to where Declan sat and looked down at the man who was, biologically, legally, impossibly, his father. Did you ever think about us? Even once? Did you ever wonder if we were alive? If we were happy? If we needed you? Declan looked up and his eyes were red. Every day, he whispered. Every single day. And every day I convinced myself I had made the right choice, that you were better off without me, that I was protecting you from what? Aiden's voice was hard. From having a father who was ashamed of us? From having a mother who loved us but wasn't allowed to? From knowing we had siblings, a family, a story? From me, Declan said simply. From the man I was. From the coward who cared more about his reputation than his children. Grace stepped forward and placed the tape recorder in Sean's hands. This is yours now. All three of you. Your mother's voice. The only thing she could leave you that your father couldn't take away. Outside, through the hospital windows, Dublin was going about its evening. People were heading home from work, collecting children from school, starting dinner, living ordinary lives. Inside, three young people stood in a triangle, holding between them a truth that would change everything. For them, for their parents, and perhaps for Ireland itself. The tape began to play again, someone having accidentally pressed the button. Moira's voice filled the waiting room, singing that ancient lullaby, and for the first time in 18 years, her children heard their mother sing to them. Grace closed her eyes and whispered, "They're going to meet each other, whether I want them to or not." Chapter 6. The Three Songs of the Past. The song echoed through the hospital corridors, invading every hidden memory. Grace closed her eyes and remembered the birth 18 years before. The sound of scissors, the muffled scream, the fear in Moira's gaze. Declan entered his office and locked the door. He opened a drawer, removed a yellowed letter, and read in silence. It was Moira's letter, which he had hidden all these years. "They're yours, Declan. And if one day they come back, tell them I loved them in my own way." He had crumpled it at the time, but never had the courage to burn it. Sean and Niamh listened to the recording until the end. The song finished with an almost inaudible phrase. "I saw them from the car window, and I cried until dawn." Sean covered his face with his hands. She tried to come back, and he lied to everyone. Niamh faced Declan when he returned. "The guilt isn't just hers, is it?" The man, pale, murmured. "She believed I would save them. I condemned them." The rain fell heavily outside. Grace watched through the window and said, almost in prayer, "Shame is what kills first, but today you can decide if it dies alone." Niamh squeezed Sean's hand. "We're not going to let this stay hidden, even if the whole country needs to hear this story." The letter Declan held was written on hospital notepaper, the kind given to new mothers to record birth details and feeding times. But Moira hadn't written about milk or nappies. She had written a confession, a plea, and a goodbye. "Declan, I know what you're thinking. I can see it in your eyes, in the way you won't look at them, won't hold them, won't say their names. You're thinking about your career, your family, your reputation. You're thinking about what people will say when they see that your children are black, that your wife was unfaithful, that the perfect image you've built is a lie. But they're not a lie. They're real. 3 babies who didn't ask to be born into this mess, who didn't ask to have a father too proud to love them and a mother too weak to fight for them. I can't be the woman you wanted me to be anymore. I can't pretend this didn't happen, but I can't be strong enough to keep them either. Not against you, not against everything you represent. So I'm asking you, begging you, if they ever come looking for answers, tell them I love them. Tell them I sang to them. Tell them that every choice I made, every cowardly decision, was because I thought it would protect them from a world that wouldn't understand. Tell them I was wrong. Tell them I'm sorry." Declan had read this letter 1,000 times over 18 years. He had memorized every word, every crossed-out phrase, every tear stain on the paper. He had kept it hidden in his office, locked in a drawer behind files and legal documents, as if burying it deep enough would make it stop existing. But tonight, with his children just rooms away, with his wife unconscious in a hospital bed with cameras and journalists in the entire country demanding answers, the letter felt alive. It pulsed in his hands like a beating heart, like something that had been waiting all this time to be acknowledged. Grace had her own letter, though she had never written it down. It existed only in her memory, in the words she had rehearsed 1,000 times but never said aloud. It was the letter she would have sent to the adoption agencies, to the foster families, to anyone who would listen. These children deserved to know they were wanted. They deserved to know their mother sang to them, that she cried for them, that she loved them even as she let them go. They deserved to know they were born on a night when the rain fell like tears, when the wind howled like grief, when 3 tiny voices cried out for comfort and received only silence. I held them. I cleaned them. I counted their fingers and toes. I looked into their eyes and saw futures stretching out before them, futures that should have included each other, that should have included their mother's love and their father's protection. Instead, they got separate homes, separate lives, separate stories. and I did nothing to stop it. Grace had carried this guilt for 18 years, had let it shape her decision to adopt Neve, had poured all her regret and sorrow into being the mother she couldn't be to the other two children. And now, watching the three of them together, she wondered if love could ever truly compensate for abandonment, or if some wounds were too deep to heal. Sean was still listening to the tape, rewinding it to hear his mother's voice again and again. Each time he noticed something new, the way her voice cracked on certain words, the Irish accent that became stronger when she sang, the love and desperation woven through every note. He had spent his whole life wondering what his mother's voice sounded like. Now he knew, and it broke his heart. Neve had pulled out her phone and was recording everything. Not for a story, not anymore, but for evidence, for memory, for proof that this moment had happened. She filmed the tape recorder, the letter Declan was holding, Grace's tear-stained face, Sean's trembling hands. She filmed Aidan standing by the window, looking out at Dublin's lights, looking like a man trying to find his place in a world that had just been rewritten. "We need to see her," Aidan said suddenly. "Our mother. We need to see Moira." Declan looked up sharply. "She's not well. The doctor said—" "I don't care what the doctor said," Aidan interrupted. "We've waited 18 years. We can't wait any longer." But when they tried to enter Moira's room, they found it empty. The bed was made, the machines were silent, and a nurse was changing the sheets with the efficiency of someone who had done this task 1,000 times before. "Where is she?" Sean asked, panic rising in his voice. The nurse looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Walsh checked herself out about an hour ago, against medical advice. She left this." She handed over an envelope, white, sealed, with that same blue ribbon tied around it. Neve took it with shaking hands. The envelope was addressed in Moira's handwriting. "To my children, if you can forgive me enough to read this." Inside was a single sheet of paper with just a few lines. "I couldn't face you. Not yet. Not like this, in a hospital where everything began and nothing was right. If you want to find me, I'll be where I should have been all along, at the place where I said goodbye to you the first time. University Hospital, Galway, November 12th, the anniversary of your birth. I'll wait there from dawn until you come, or until I die waiting, whichever comes first. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I failed you in every way a mother can fail, but I need you to know the truth. All of it, not just the parts I sang into a tape recorder 18 years ago. I need you to hear what really happened that night, why I made the choices I made and why I've been dying slowly ever since. Your father is not the villain of this story. Neither am I. We're just two people who were too weak to be what you needed, too scared to do what was right, too trapped in our own fear to see that we were condemning 3 innocent lives to the same imprisonment. Come to Galway. Let me tell you everything. And then, if you want to walk away and never speak to me again, I'll understand. At least I will have seen your faces one more time. At least I will have told you the truth. With all the love I wasn't brave enough to show Moira." The waiting room fell silent. Even the hospital's constant hum of activity seemed to pause, as if the building itself was holding its breath. A television producer pushed through the hospital doors, out of breath, holding up a phone. "The recording," he gasped. "The lullaby. It's gone viral. It's everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, the news sites. The entire country is listening to it right now." He turned his phone around to show them. The video had millions of views already. Comments flooded in by the thousands. Some supportive, some angry, some just confused. Irish Twitter was exploding with hashtags: "Young Galway babies," 3 voices, "Justice for Moira," "Declan Walsh resign." Grace covered her mouth with her hand. Sean closed his eyes. Niamh stared at the phone screen, watching the numbers climb. And Aidan, practical Aidan who had spent his life building things with his hands, finally understood that some things, once broken, could never be put back together the same way. "Galway," Sean said quietly. "We go to Galway." Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the hospital windows like fingers tapping out a rhythm, or like the echo of a lullaby that had waited 18 years to be heard. Chapter 7. The Public Judgment. Outside the hospital, cameras, lights, and microphones formed a sea of noise. Declan emerged with his face weary under relentless flashes. "Judge Walsh, do you confirm that you abandoned 3 children in 2007? Are these children your sons?" He took a deep breath and faced the lenses. "Yes. The silence that followed was absolute. No sound, not from the wind, not from the rain. And I've carried this lie for 18 years, thinking that reputation was more important than truth. In the Dublin Castle Hall, now taken over by reporters, Niamh and Sean took the microphone. For years we grew up not knowing who we were. Today, we know too much. But we don't want punishment. We want no one else to have to live through what we lived through. Grace watched from the back, tears streaming down, like a mother watching her children grow up again. Declan tried to approach them. If I could go back in time, Sean interrupted him. You can't, but you can choose not to lie anymore. Moira, now awake in her bed, asked to see them. Let them come. I want to hear them. The group walked to the room and the sound of footsteps echoed like a countdown. The journey from Dublin to Galway should have taken 3 hours. It took them 5 because they kept stopping, to breathe, to think, to process what was happening. Sean drove Grace's old Volkswagen. Niamh sat in the passenger seat with the envelope clutched to her chest, and Aidan was in the back, staring out at the Irish countryside rolling past in shades of green and grey. Declan followed in his own car, keeping a respectful distance. He had tried to join them, tried to explain, tried to somehow make 18 years of abandonment sound reasonable, but Sean had simply said, "Follow if you want, but you're not part of this yet. You haven't earned that right." The silence in the car was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who had spent their whole lives feeling alone and were only now beginning to understand that they had never been alone at all. They had been separated, scattered across Ireland like seeds in the wind, but they had always been connected by blood and by the song their mother had sung to them on the night they were born. "What are we going to say to her?" Niamh finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Sean admitted. "I've been trying to think of something for the past 2 hours and I've got nothing. What do you say to a mother who gave birth to you and then let you go? What do you say to someone who loved you but wasn't strong enough to keep you?" Aidan leaned forward from the back seat. "Maybe we don't say anything. Maybe we just listen. That's what she asked for in the letter, isn't it? To tell us the truth, to explain. And if the explanation isn't good enough?" Niamh's voice was sharp. "If she just confirms what we already know, that she was ashamed, that Declan convinced her, that she chose her reputation over her children, then at least we'll know," Sean said quietly. "At least we won't spend the rest of our lives wondering." Grace, who had insisted on coming despite her age and exhaustion, spoke from where she sat beside Aidan in the back. "Your mother loved you. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know love without action is just empty words. But I saw her face that night. I saw how she looked at you and I saw how it destroyed her to let you go. Why didn't she fight harder?" Aidan's voice was raw. "Why didn't she tell Declan to go to hell? Why didn't she choose us? Because she was 28 years old, married to one of the most powerful prosecutors in Ireland, with no money of her own, no education, no support system. Because she believed him when he said taking you would ruin all your lives because—" Grace's voice broke. "Because sometimes the system is designed to make women believe they have no choices, and by the time they realize they do, it's too late." By the time they reached Galway, night had fallen. The city lights reflected off the wet streets and the Atlantic wind carried the salt smell of the sea. University Hospital Galway stood exactly as it had 18 years before. Grey, imposing, full of stories that would never be told. They found Moira in the hospital chapel, a small room most people forgot existed. She was sitting in the front pew, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the simple wooden cross on the wall. She looked older than her 46 years, as if grief had aged her prematurely. Her hair, once auburn, was streaked with gray. Her face was thin, almost gaunt, and her hands trembled slightly even when at rest. When they entered, she didn't turn around immediately. She said very quietly, "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Neither were we," Sean replied. Moira finally turned, and when she saw them, all 3 of them, standing together for the first time in 18 years, her face crumpled. She didn't cry dramatically. She just seemed to collapse inward, as if the reality of them was too much to bear. "You look," she started, then stopped. "You look like me, all of you, in different ways, but I can see myself in your faces." Niamh stepped forward. "We came because you asked, because you said you'd tell us the truth. So tell us, all of it." Moira nodded, taking a shaking breath. The truth is I had an affair. Your father, your biological father, was a colleague of Declan's, a barrister from Lagos visiting on a case. It happened during a time when my marriage was already dying. Declan and I hadn't been intimate in over a year. He was obsessed with his career and I was lonely. She paused, gathering courage. When I found out I was pregnant, I told Declan immediately. I thought if I was honest, if I confessed, we could work through it. I was naive. He was furious, but not in the way you might think. He wasn't angry about the betrayal. He was angry about the implications, about what people would think, about how it would affect his career. He wanted you to get rid of us, Aiden said flatly. Yes, but I refused. I told him I would leave, that I would raise the baby on my own, that he didn't have to acknowledge it. Then we found out at the 20-week scan that it wasn't one baby. It was 3, and everything changed. Sean's jaw tightened. How? How did everything change? Declan saw an opportunity. He said we could make this work, that we could pretend the babies were premature, that we'd lose them tragically, that the whole thing would make us sympathetic rather than scandalous. He had it all planned out. But when you were born, she closed her eyes. When you were born, and you were so obviously not his children, he panicked. The plan fell apart. So he convinced you to abandon us. Neve's voice was ice. He told me it was the only way, that if I kept you, we'd all be destroyed, that you would grow up with everyone knowing you were the product of an affair, that you'd be bullied, ostracized, that my shame would become your shame. He said the kindest thing I could do was give you to families who could love you without the weight of scandal. And you believed him, Sean said. I believed him because I wanted to, because I was a coward, because letting you go was easier than fighting for you. Moira's voice broke completely now. I have spent every single day of the past 18 years wishing I had been braver. I have visited your graves, not real graves, but the places in my mind where I buried you. I have celebrated your birthdays alone. I have wondered if you were happy, if you were loved, if you ever thought about me. The chapel was silent except for Moira's quiet weeping. Outside they could hear the hospital continuing its endless rhythm. Ambulances arriving, patients being admitted, life and death conducting their eternal dance. Declan appeared in the doorway. No one had heard him approach. He looked smaller somehow, diminished as if confession had physically shrunk him. I need to say something, he began, but Sean cut him off. No, you've said enough for 18 years. Now it's our turn. Sean stepped forward, standing directly in front of both his parents. You both made choices. Choices that destroyed our childhoods, that stole our family, that turned us into secrets to be hidden. And nothing you say now can change that. He paused, looking at each of his siblings, drawing strength from their presence. But we're making a choice too. We choose not to let your shame define us. We choose not to carry your guilt. We choose to be siblings, to be family, to be the people you should have let us be from the start. Neve moved to stand beside Sean. We're going public with this story. All of it. The affair, the abandonment, the lies. Not for revenge, but so that no other children have to grow up wondering why they weren't enough. Aiden joined them, completing the triangle. And we're doing it together. The way we should have lived our entire lives. Together. Moira stood on shaking legs. I understand. I'm so sorry, I know that's not enough, but it's all I have left to give you. At that moment, hospital security rushed in. Mrs. Walsh, Judge Walsh. There are hundreds of people outside. The media, protesters, supporters. This story has become national news. RTE is broadcasting live. The Tawi Siak has issued a statement. You need to see this. They followed the security guard to a television in the waiting area. The screen showed crowds gathered outside University Hospital, Galway, holding candles and signs. Some signs supported Moira. Others condemned Declan. Some simply read, "We hear you," with drawings of 3 babies. The news anchor was speaking. Unprecedented scenes here in Galway as Ireland grapples with a story that has touched the nation's conscience. 3 young people, separated at birth, reunited by chance and a nurse's conscience. A judge's career in ruins. A mother's confession. And at the heart of it all, questions about shame, secrets, and the price of reputation. When they emerged from the hospital, the crowd fell silent. Hundreds of faces turned towards them, cameras flashing, but no one spoke. It was as if the entire country was holding its breath. Sean, Neve, and Aiden stood together on the hospital steps. Behind them, Moira and Declan stood apart, both looking broken in different ways. And beside them, Grace, the woman who had kept the secret and then set it free. Sean raised his hand and somehow, impossibly, the silence deepened. "My name is Sean Dubhain. These are my siblings, Nayav and Aiden. 18 years ago, we were born in this hospital and immediately separated. Tonight we stand here together for the first time, not as victims, but as survivors. Not as a scandal, but as a family." The crowd erupted, but not in chaos, in applause, in tears, in recognition of something profound and painful and ultimately hopeful. As they walked back into the hospital to finally sit together, to talk as siblings, to begin the long process of healing, the rain that had been falling since Dublin finally stopped, and in the silence that followed, you could almost hear it, the echo of an old lullaby, carried on the wind from the sea. Chapter 8. The Reign of Galway. The envelope bore the hospital seal and the same blue ribbon from 18 years before. Neve opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter. "If you hear me, I'll know I lived long enough. Forgiveness is the love that doesn't die, even when life ends. If you want to find me, I'll be in the sound of the rain." Sean couldn't contain his tears. Aiden, who arrived at that moment, embraced them both. For the first time, the three were together, not as victims but as siblings. Months later, the city of Galway awoke in silence. In a discreet ceremony, the triplets placed flowers on Moira's grave. Grace watched from a distance. Declan, standing apart, removed the ring from his finger and left it on the marble. "She deserved more than my fear." Sean, with a serene voice, read the letter aloud before everyone. "May this be the last secret buried in this place." As fine rain fell on their faces, the three looked up at the sky. The sound of water hitting the ground resembled a melody, the same lullaby from the tape. The voices merged with the wind, and for an instant, it seemed that Moira was singing again. 6 months had passed since that night at the hospital. 6 months of therapy sessions, awkward family dinners, late-night phone calls between siblings who were still learning how to be siblings. 6 months of media attention that gradually faded as Ireland moved on to the next scandal, the next tragedy, the next story. But for Sean, Neve, and Aiden, those 6 months had been a lifetime compressed into half a year. They had learned each other's habits, discovered shared mannerisms they couldn't possibly have learned from environment, found comfort in resemblances that went deeper than appearance. They argued about politics and music and whether Galway or Dublin made better fish and chips. They laughed at inside jokes that formed quickly, as if making up for 18 years of lost laughter. Moira had not attended any of their meetings. After that night in the hospital chapel, she had quietly checked herself into a private facility in Cork, citing exhaustion and mental health concerns. The truth was more complicated. The truth was that facing her children once had nearly destroyed her, and facing them repeatedly, seeing their hurt and anger and desperate need for a mother she didn't know how to be, that was beyond her capacity. She wrote them letters instead, long, rambling letters that arrived weekly, filled with apologies and explanations and memories she had carried alone for too long. She told them about the Nigerian barrister, Adewale his name was, who had returned to Lagos before she even knew she was pregnant. She told them how she had tried to find him, to tell him, but he had died in a car accident 3 months before they were born. She told them about the music she had listened to whilst pregnant, the books she had read, the dreams she had had for them before fear stole those dreams away. Declan had resigned from the bench within a week of the scandal breaking. It wasn't a choice. The Judicial Conduct Committee had made it clear that his position was untenable. But he had also resigned from something deeper, from the performance of righteousness he had maintained for decades. He sold the Dublin house and moved to a small cottage in Connemara, far from anyone who knew his name or his shame. He wrote letters too, though his were shorter, more factual. He established trust funds for all 3 children, not to buy forgiveness, he said, but to provide what he should have provided from the beginning. He attended addiction counseling, though he claimed he wasn't addicted to anything except the approval of others. And he asked in every letter if he could see them, just once more, just to explain face to face. They hadn't answered that question yet. Grace had retired from nursing the month after the story broke, not because anyone forced her to, but because she had finally allowed herself to rest. She spent her time in Galway, walking along Salt Hill Promenade, visiting the hospital chapel where she had prayed so many times over the years. She was there the day the letter came. It was addressed to all three of them, in handwriting that had grown shakier, more desperate. My darling children, I am writing this from the facility in Cork. The doctors say I'm making progress, but I know the truth. Some wounds are too deep to heal, some guilt too heavy to ever set down. I am not getting better. I am just learning to live with what I've done. I want you to know that every choice I made was wrong, but none of them were made lightly. I thought about you constantly. I mourned you whilst you were still alive. I created entire lives for you in my imagination. Birthdays, first days of school, graduations, weddings. I was at all of them in my mind, even though I had surrendered the right to be there in reality. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even think I deserve the chance to ask for it, but I need you to know that you were loved. Imperfectly, cowardly, from a distance, but loved nonetheless. If something happens to me, please don't mourn. Mourn the mother I should have been, but not the woman I actually was. She doesn't deserve your tears. All my love, for whatever it's worth, Moira. The call came 3 weeks later. Moira Walsh had died in her sleep at the facility in Cork. The official cause was heart failure, but everyone who knew the story understood it was something else. It was heartbreak. It was guilt. It was the accumulated weight of 18 years of secrets finally crushing the woman who had carried them. The funeral was small. Just the triplets, Grace, Declan, and a handful of people from Moira's past who had never known about the children. The priest kept the service brief and impersonal, perhaps sensing that anything more specific would open wounds too raw to expose in public. They buried her in Galway, in a cemetery overlooking the Atlantic, where the sound of waves could reach her even underground. The headstone was simple. Moira Walsh, 1979-2025. Mother, singer, forgiven. It was Sean who had insisted on that last word. She asked for forgiveness, he said. Who are we to deny her that, even in death? After the service, the three of them stood by the grave whilst others left. The rain had started, soft at first, then gradually building in intensity until it sounded like applause, like the finale of a song that had been playing for 18 years. Do you forgive her? Niev asked quietly. Sean was silent for a long moment. I don't know. I think I understand her, which isn't the same thing. I think she was weak and scared and trapped in a system that punished women for being human. I think she made terrible choices, but I also think she suffered for those choices in ways we'll never fully comprehend. Aiden nodded. She gave us life and then gave us away. Both of those things are true. Both of those things matter. She also gave us each other, Niev added. Not intentionally, not directly, but here we are. Three people who should never have found each other, standing together because a nurse kept an envelope and a mother made a tape recording and a truth refused to stay buried. They stood in silence, watching the rain create patterns on the fresh earth of their mother's grave. And then, spontaneously, without discussing it, they began to sing. The lullaby, the one from the tape. Swan trai nam blianta, a stormo croi. Their voices were untrained, imperfect, but they blended in ways that voices shaped by the same womb always do. And as they sang, the rain seemed to join them, creating a rhythm, a harmony, as if the earth itself was acknowledging their song. Grace watched from under an umbrella, tears mixing with rain on her face. She had kept the secret. She had revealed the secret, and now she was witnessing the aftermath. Not closure exactly, but something like it. Something like peace. Declan stood apart from everyone, his hands in his pockets, rain soaking through his coat. He looked older than his 49 years, diminished by shame in ways that time alone could never accomplish. When the singing ended, he approached slowly, carefully, as if afraid they might flee. I know I have no right to ask, he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. But may I join you? In remembering her? The three of them looked at each other, communicating in that wordless way they were still learning. But that came more naturally with each passing day. Finally, Sean spoke. You can stand with us. But you're not standing as our father. You haven't earned that yet. You're standing as someone who knew her, who failed her, who has to live with that, just like we all do. Declan nodded, accepting the terms. He took his place slightly behind them, not part of the triangle, but not entirely separate either. And they stood together in the rain, 5 people bound by tragedy and blood and the complicated mathematics of forgiveness. The rain continued to fall, washing over the cemetery, over Galway, over all of Ireland. And somewhere in that rain, in the sound of water meeting stone, meeting earth, meeting flesh, there was a song, the same song Moira had sung 18 years before, the same song that had traveled through time and technology and shame to finally reach her children's ears. As they turned to leave, Niamh looked back once more at the grave. "Do you think she can hear us?" she asked. "I think," Grace said softly, "that she's been hearing you all along. She just couldn't hear herself above the sound of her own regret." They walked towards the cemetery gates together, the rain gradually easing, the Atlantic wind carrying salt and stories from across the sea. Behind them, Moira's grave lay quiet beneath fresh flowers and falling rain, a monument to secrets that had finally, painfully, been transformed into truth. There are secrets that time tries to bury, but the heart always finds a way to bring them back to the surface. Moira believed that hiding the truth would protect those she loved, and Declan believed that shame was more bearable than forgiveness. In the end, they both discovered the same thing. Lies can postpone pain, but never cure it. The children born from rejection transformed pain into voice. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson of this story. No one is defined by the abandonment they suffered, but by the courage to forgive without forgetting. If you were in their place, would you have extended your hand? Would you have forgiven those who destroyed your childhood? Or would you have chosen the silence that consumes from within? The sound of that song beneath Galway's rain continues echoing, reminding us that true love doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right moment to be heard. In the rain, in the voices, in the memory of 3 babies who became 3 people who became one family, there is a truth that Ireland will carry forward, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to love despite it. And somewhere, in the sound of rain falling on marble and earth, Moira Walsh finally rests, not forgiven by everyone, not understood by all, but no longer alone in her secret. Her children carry her story now, transformed from shame into something that might someday resemble grace. The end.